Thank you very much for that, John. There were some very interesting things that John said. I picked up the word massacre. That's interesting. I heard that word on the BBC the other day. They were talking about Ireland. Isn't that interesting? Not 25 years ago, not only could you not use words like massacre, or at least if it was anything done by the British, but you couldn't even interview anybody who supported Sinn Féin and the Provisionals, or who would not denounce violence. There was a broadcasting ban. There was this total closure on what could be said. Those who remember that period, the terrorists are the IRA. The IRA are criminals. Absolute line in the sand. And suddenly, everything changes. There's an approved piece. The Queen goes there, and you listen to the news, and I hear the words, "The Queen is going to a football stadium where British troops massacred Irish people." I listened to this, shook my head, I thought, no, he's read it wrong. What? You know, I couldn't believe these words being spoken. And I think the lesson from that is that it's not that all those years the journalists and the BBC did not know that British troops had massacred Irish people. They knew all the time. Just as they know exactly what is now happening in Israel. And as John says, they are working within an ironclad system of what they understand can be said. And they say to us quite openly, the quote that John gave was from a journalist who was actually the editor of the main television news. So he had been. He'd edited the BBC News. I was at an away day in Kew Gardens for the top 40 editors and producers and programme makers in the BBC. They asked me to go down after the last book was published to talk about our findings. And I went there, gave the paper, everything that was in the book, and as you can imagine, there was a lot of humming and hawing, but I did it all. We then went out and had coffee. A very intensive debate then developed in the coffee area. And I was with the editor of Newsnight and an editor from the main evening BBC One News. And the Newsnight editor said, "Oh, it can't be as bad as Greg's saying." And the man from BBC One said, "It's worse." He said, and he looked at me and said, "You were too easy on them." And he said, and these were the words he spoke to. He said, "We wait in fear for the telephone call from the Israelis." He said, the only issue then becomes, or the issues then become, how high up has it come from in their organisation? Has it come from one of their monitoring groups? Has it come from the embassy? Is it higher than that? And the other issue is, how high up our organisation has it gone? Is it gone to the duty editor? Is it to the editor of the news programme? Is it gone to the board of governors or the trust or whatever? How high? What have we got to deal with in terms of the flag? And he said that he had, as an editor, minutes before he had gone on, had journalists saying to him, what the words we can use, what can we say, is it okay to say this? When the book came out last time, I was interviewed several times by BBC, and journalists said to me, before we started the interview, journalists would say to me, well, I remember one in particular saying to me, look, you must raise the issue of the pressure that we are under. And she said, I can't ask you about that in the interview. But I've got to be, I can't go there, but make sure that you get it into your responses. Right? So she couldn't even mention it as an issue, but she told me before it started to get it into my responses. And as John said, there are very many good people in there. They know exactly what's happening. And many are very troubled by what is happening. Some of the best quotes, I thought, in the previous book and in this volume, actually come from journalists. I mean, one very senior Middle East journalist, correspondent, said to us that what is missing is the notion that what is happening here is an occupied people, a people who are trying to throw off a military occupation. That is the perspective that is not set on the news. You can have tragedy, you can have it's all awful, there are terrible images, you can put all kinds of things on. You can't put that alternative analysis. That's what's missing. And I think that's the core of the argument in the new book. That when the Second Intifada developed, broke, and became a major news item, and at the same time there was a very rapid growth in new technology in broadcasting, the problem that all governments faced, especially those involved in conflict and war, was that images of war could now be brought into the home. The most terrible, immediate, graphic images could be publicly available, either through television services or through cable, satellite, or through the internet. So you could see the actual deaths of women, children, terrible consequences of war, immediately as they happened. And the response of that, by many governments, but Israel in particular, was to develop the most sophisticated approach to international relations and publicity and public relations, all combined, that we have, I think, yet seen. And what they did was to set up, first, a national information directorate, and they planned what people would hear and understand about the Gaza attack from about a year before it happened. I'm talking about the Gaza attack, December 2008, January 2009. And the National Information Director ensured that everybody spoke the same message, the same words, the same account. The whole intention of this approach was that every time viewers saw a terrible graphic image, they would immediately get with it the Israeli explanation of why this had occurred, of the origins, the history of the conflict, the reason why this action was necessary, and at the same time, the Israelis would say, this is terrible, this is an awful situation, we don't want this, we are being attacked all the time, this is us responding, and you will hear this again and again and again. And all of these words that you hear are tested and worked through in the most sophisticated way. I mean, many of you have probably seen this, the Israel Project. It's a fascinating study if you look at this. This is literally a language and communications and public relations project developed in America. And it is designed to provide and test the exact words that international audiences are to hear about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it goes on, I've only got a couple of pages here, but it's actually about 140 pages long. It is an extraordinarily long, detailed document. And it literally tests almost anything you can say about the conflict. And every page has got the most explicit instructions about exactly what word to say in what circumstance. So it literally has pages saying words that work, more words that work. And at the bottom of each page it says absolutely not for distribution or publication, property of the Israel Project. Do not read out under any circumstances in SOAS. It doesn't actually say that, it says the first two. But what is interesting about the project is that all of the words that you will hear about the desire for peace, that Israel is a peaceful nation, that the Palestinians or that the Hamas doesn't want peace, and this is another one, that the issue that they say, you must always distinguish between Hamas and the Palestinians. And what we found fascinating was that when you actually check the exact words which they've said, they have a whole pages and pages of words that work, more words that work, and then words that don't work, words that you're not to say, like you're not to say anything about religion. Don't say anything at all about the religious claim to Israel, because that doesn't work with American audiences, you know, so that's all gone out of the propaganda, you know, don't do that one anymore, you know. Now we do, we want peace, Hamas are the terrorists, you know, exactly what you hear again and again and again on the news. And what was interesting is when we tested these ourselves, went and looked at the TV news, we found that the words in the TV news exactly paralleled the words in the Israel Project that they were recommending. So it says, make sure you absolutely distinguish between Hamas and the Palestinians. Even though the Palestinians have elected Hamas, you create the idea that Hamas is this tiny terrorist group who want to do nothing but attack Israel. And the TV news, much of it, just simply bought this. So look at this is BBC One headline from the 31st of December. The bombardment continues on Hamas targets. And 4 days later, the offensive against Hamas enters its second week. It's an offensive against Hamas. It's not about the Palestinians at all. It's Hamas that's being attacked. And if only the Palestinians, if only Hamas would stop this terrible initiation of violence, if only they'd stop this terrible sequence of events, whereby they keep attacking Israel and Israel has to respond, retaliate. Remember those words? We analysed all of this language in the book. And you found, in the last book and this one, you find this constant control over the sequence of events. Because this is the core of the propaganda. To control the sequence with which the audience sees the events. So people will hear that the Palestinians have fired rockets and Israel has responded. What they won't hear is that before the Gaza attack, there are over 1,500 Palestinians killed in the few years before that attack. You won't hear that hundreds of children have been killed before the Gaza attack. You hear that the Palestinians have, for some reason, stopped the ceasefire. You don't hear that the Israelis broke the ceasefire on November the 3rd of 2008. These issues are absolutely crucial, because then when you go out into the audience groups, people will repeat word for word that analysis. And one of the most important findings of the book is that it actually now doesn't matter what images people see. People will be very upset by the images, but they are now getting used to the idea that war generates terrible images. And they're sad and they think it's awful, but it doesn't affect their opinion anymore. And this is very important, because in the past, people would say, oh, you get the pictures out and that. You remember the arguments about the Vietnam War? That famous picture of the GIs with the Zippo lighter setting light to the village, and this was all seen to the thatched house, and this was seen as a sort of crucial moment in American public understanding. But now, an image like that really wouldn't matter, because a public relations expert would say, well, there were arms inside that cottage, and the whole village was actually wired up for explosives, so the best thing to do was to set light to it, and that made it safe for the local people. You know, they would just make up a story like that. It wouldn't bother them at all. And when you go out and interview people, you find that people will simply repeat the words, the same words that are in the Israel Project. You know, people up and down Britain, you could just take a random group of people and you say to them, what did you think when you saw the pictures, you know, these terrible pictures? We did a lot of focus groups, interviews, straight after the Gaza attack. And we said, what did you think when you saw the pictures of the women and dead children? What did it do to you? Who did you blame in your head for this happening? And here's an example which is very typical of the response, because the great majority of the people that we interviewed actually thought that it was the Palestinians who'd broken the ceasefire. They thought that, and they kept citing the rockets, because everyone kept hearing about rockets all the time. And this is, I thought, a really fascinating quote from a woman who we interviewed. And she said as follows: when I saw the pictures of the dead children, it was dreadful. I was in tears. But it didn't make me feel that the Palestinians and Hamas were right. I think the Palestinians haven't taken the chance to work towards a peaceful solution. that they just aren't taking the chances. And it is straight out of the manual. Palestinians want peace, and but Hamas is using dead children to whip up more hatred. They're terrorists. They don't behave like an elected political party. If they were behaving like a political party, they wouldn't have arms and rockets in amongst the people. All of these were being said again and again and again on the news. And I actually said to this interviewer, I don't know if this interviewee, I said, I don't know if you've heard this, but it was said at the time that Hamas and Palestinians had offered to stop the rockets if Israel would lift the economic blockade. Everyone was terribly shocked by this. And she said, that can't be true. She said, if I heard something like that, she said, I want to know who said it. Who said that? Who could have said something like that? And I said, well, actually, it was the ex-head of Mossad, the Israeli head of the Israeli Secret Service. I said, it was reported in Israel and in some of the papers here. But obviously, and I said, where did you get your information from? She said, oh, Radio 4, BBC. I listened to it all the time. Today programme. And this week on the Today programme, you will have heard the interviews, and there was an absolutely classic example of this control of the sequence of events and how people are to understand it. And John Humphreys was interviewing Mark Regev, the Israeli spokesman, and Humphreys says to him, well, these people have walked across the border. He says, they say, they believe, he said Humphreys, that they are going back to homes that they believe that they were pushed out of. I mean, not that they were actually pushed out of, but they somehow have this belief, you know, as if it's contested that people were pushed out of their homes. But nonetheless, the question is put. And Regev answers that, well, he says, people have been told lies about history, he says, which I thought was a cracking opening. And at that time I was going, yes, you know, and I actually agreed with him when he said that. And people have been told lies about history. He said, and he said, there was a war. He said, there was a war. He said, and the United Nations had put up these, they wanted two separate states, and the Palestinians hadn't accepted it. He said, there was a war. He said, and you got refugees. So the sequence in his set of events is that there's a war, and because of the war, you get refugees. Now, even the Israeli historians now write about Plan Dalet, which you will all know about, which was the plan to evacuate, to force out Palestinians from civilian areas in the period before Israel was set up. So the plan, which you can read all about from documents from the Israeli archives, the plan which involved attacking Palestinian civilian areas for the first time, lobbing large amounts of high explosives into civilian areas to create terror, to force people to flee, to scare people to move in, and physical attacks, firing with a weapon called the Davida, I think it was called, high explosives into Palestinian towns. This is the first time it's done. It's all written about and explained in great detail by Avi Schleim in his book, The Iron Wall. And that plan was enacted and begun in early April 1948. The war began later, in the middle of May. So the attacks on the Palestinian areas began before the war. The refugees were created before the war broke out as a quite deliberate plan to force Palestinians out of areas which were designed to be made part of the future state of Israel. Now that is historical record. And on the Today programme, Mark Regev reverses that sequence. He says there's a war and then you get refugees. And it passes, 2 million, it's not corrected, nobody says, actually, you got that back to front. Nobody says it. No journalist says, actually, that wasn't true. But you have a couple of million people listening to that programme, goes out into the ether. That sequence, if only the Palestinians, which we heard again and again in our focus groups, the Palestinians, in that case, if the Arabs hadn't started the war, then you wouldn't have had refugees. If they just stopped firing the rockets, then it would all be okay. If. And that control over public understanding, that control over the narratives by which people make sense and understand the pictures that they see, has become absolutely crucial. And I have to say, in a room like this, where most of us have probably quite a high level of knowledge of the issues involved in this, that news offends us and we want to throw bricks at the radio and the TV and things. It doesn't get through to us. But to the bulk of the population who really do not know what is happening, do not have that history, then it works very, very well. And the propaganda battle, the ideological battle, goes hand in hand with the military offensives and the military control. And the struggle over language, the struggle to control not just the words that people use, but people's understanding of the sequence of events, the origins of events, the reasons why they are seeing pictures of broken bodies of children. That control over that is now absolutely central, and it's what we explain and discuss in the book. And I hope that people will use the book as a tool, as a way of unpacking what is being said on the TV. They will use it to complain, to develop ways of showing the untruths, the misinformation that is being given. And the book begins with a very detailed history of the conflict, with an account of what all the different historians have said, all the evidence. So it's there for people to use, to keep writing in and to say, this is wrong. You said this and it's not true. This is the alternative account. Why have you not got it on? It's not. Part of it is to say there ought to be a Palestinian perspective, but another part of it is to say you've got to be accurate. You've got to tell what's true. If somebody puts out a full statement about the history of the war when Israel was established, then that should be corrected. It's not acceptable that false information is allowed to go out in that way. And I hope that people will use the book, take it, and use it to produce a better informed public. And hopefully, when these change, when the situation does change, when America stops paying for the whole thing to keep going on, when we do get some sort of alternative, then I think the journalists who do know about this, who are interested in this, will gradually get more freedom to actually tell the truth. But part of the struggle outside, part of the reason to put the pressure on the media, to keep writing, to keep criticising, to keep demanding the truth, accuracy, balance, is that it enormously strengthens the hand of the journalists in there. If you've got people outside pushing and pushing and raising it. Because it is not an easy thing to be a journalist trying to tell the truth when there is such a weight of power against you. And I hope the book helps just a bit to push it in the other direction. Okay.